Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 7th of February 2022. I am joined as ever by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman. How are you doing this afternoon, Andy?
I'm I'm happy and I'm apprehensive. I'm happy because last night I was involved in a local planning issue where the side I was batting for won, which is a good thing.
Oh, that's good.
But yep, it was only peripherally a heritage issue. It was it's interesting to see local democracy working actually with the elected councillors responding to concerns in the community. So that was a good one. But I've just had an email this morning saying that there's digging work, mechanical diggers working on a local grade 2 listed site where there's a planning application in for which hasn't been decided yet. So after we finish recording, I'm going to have to go down and see what's going on.
Okay.
And
is that a news story or is that a local community concern?
It's a local community concern at the moment because nothing's proven. If somebody's been doing work, and worst case scenario is they're destroying a structure within the footprint of the site, within the curtilage of the site, which has for some reason been omitted from the heritage impact assessment, then it becomes an issue very quickly.
Okay, interesting. We'll keep an eye on that. Anyway, while we're waiting on that, our Watching Brief continues. And as ever, we're here to bring you the news from the archaeological world of the week for you to examine, discuss below, and hopefully add to that understanding and that conversation. And this week we have a couple of threads that we're tugging on, starting though with a preliminary look at the CIfA, that is the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, minimum salary recommendations, brackets UK only. We are approaching the 1st of April 2022, and these have been announced as posts requiring competence / responsibility at is it CIfA? CIfA?
Practitioner level.
Practitioner level. Okay, practitioner level. Basically starts at £21,100. The next level being 24,600, and the next level after that being £31,600. And just to compare that to last year's recommended salaries recommendations, that's up from 20,400 to 21,100. And this is interesting because it seems to be making for the first time in a while, certainly I've noticed people actually making waves as to what they will and will not tolerate in terms of job advertising based on these sort of salary levels. Is this a good thing? Are we actually sort of slowly moving that boulder up the hill?
Well, yes, in terms of if it's bringing more attention to wage levels in archaeology, which are notoriously poor, and the fact that people are talking about it, that is a good thing. It's an even better thing if people actually start doing something about it, but I'll come to that in a minute. And I think we also have to step back and see this against the sort of national canvas, as it were, when press, politicians of all parties are talking about a, quote, cost of living crisis. Coming out of the COVID pandemic, as we seem to be, hopefully, with society adjusting to a new normal, whether that means going back to as you were pre-March 2020, or whether it means adjusting to working from home some of the time or even all of the time. Some jobs gone, some jobs retained, heavy hits in retail and hospitality and all the rest of it. That is leading to an increase in inflation, basically, something that most of us haven't lived with noticeably for a long time. And the most eye-watering impact has been in energy costs, where everybody is facing something like a 50% increase in the cost of their gas and electricity. Which obviously has an impact on all levels of society, whether from your local hospital in the public sector to your the local manufacturer, your local baker who's baking your bread, and then having it delivered by truck, and so on and so on and so on. So basically, the current estimates are anything between 5 and 7%.
Yeah.
Now, on annual rise on cost impact on cost of living this year. Now, obviously, that is a particular impact on people on low incomes. And in terms of archaeology, the first two levels that of the CIfA recommended minima, and they're only recommended. They're not statutory. They're not enforceable.
No.
But the first two levels are actually below the national average wage.
Yeah, exactly. They're already below the national average wage, and this I keep on saying recommended. These recommendations, this recommended, blooming heck, rise represents just shy of a 3.5% increase. So
that's right.
Yeah, in the context of that inflation, it's still a loss of money. Actually, real terms, it's a loss. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, what it boils down to is that everybody is effectively going to be taking a pay cut because of inflation, unless they can raise their incomes by more than inflation, which then drives inflation, which is the economic argument about all this that Bank of England will be concerned about, because inflation is generally seen as a bad thing in the economy. So you have people who are already on poor wages, whose and I know companies, for example, in the public sector, who were budgeting for approximately 1.5 to 3.5% pay increase this year, now being forced to consider whether they can actually afford almost twice that if their workforces ask for it, just to keep pace with where they were.
Yeah. Just
for a standstill.
Yeah.
Clearly, that's a very difficult situation. And in archaeological terms, given that the bulk of people in archaeology work in planning archaeology, that would mean companies choosing to increase the costs that they pass on to their clients. Problem there, of course, is that we're in a situation where archaeological work isn't commissioned. It is hired after competitive tender.
Yes.
So that would require, if, for example, company A bids 1,500 quid for a job and company B bids 1,250 quid for a job, who's going to get the job? Which one is the client going to choose? Even if the company A pays its staff better.
Yeah, and particularly in the context of everyone along that chain having increased costs. Yeah.
Precisely. Right down to for example, the freelance pottery specialist who works from home and is suddenly facing a 50% hike in their gas and electricity bill.
Yeah. But even beyond that, you've got everyone, so the people who are filing the documentation in terms of the legal rights to do something on certain plots of land, the materials costs, the cost at the sandwich shop round the corner is going up. Everything is changing, and so therefore, it's going to have an impact.
Yeah, and I think I mean, just to fill out the picture a little bit. I mean, one of the biggest sources of archaeology jobs in the country is Badger. British Archaeological Jobs Resource does what it says on the tin. And David Connolly, who runs Badger, has said that he will not accept ads for companies advertising posts below the minima.
Yeah.
Now that, and again, that's a decision that he's taken, and I think a very justifiable and in a sense laudable decision that he's taken, because the pay's already low. Don't accept people who want to drive it even lower.
No.
But I think that there's a deeper question, and I put this out on my Twitter account the other day when this list first came out, and I think that is CIfA, which we've talked about many times. It's the organisation which looks after professional ethics and standards in archaeology. It's you don't have to be a member, but pretty much most practicing archaeologists.
You don't have to be mad to work around here, but it helps. So go on.
That's right. But CIfA is heavily influenced by people who are involved in contracting archaeology, the developer-funded companies, the Molars and the Oxford Archaeologies and all the others, Wessex Archaeology, and just to name three of the most famous. And so there has always been a question as to whether CIfA has been a bit diffident, actually, about raising the issue of pay conditions. It puts out these minima, but it doesn't really take any kind of active action in the way that, for example, the junior doctors who are members of the British Medical Association did a few years ago when they were offered changed contracts, and it went to industrial action. CIfA always says it isn't a trade union. Now, I think you can immediately see the problem there is that you're not a trade union. You won't try and enforce it, but you do try and set minimum wage standards. So therefore, how do you do it? And you get a sense here that we're back into the what Peter Hennessy, the historian, calls the good chaps theory of government, which is basically everyone's a good chap and they'll all settle it over a table at the club, and everyone will do the right thing in the end.
Yeah.
And I think for archaeologists at the trench faced with inflation like we're facing now on already low wages, I think there's a question of whether that kind of representation sorted out behind closed doors is actually good enough. And
but also in a national context where we decidedly are seeing national institutions, international institutions, pulled to the point of fraying, if not breaking, by people abusing this notion of good chap governance. What happens when your, I don't know, for example, your prime minister openly lies in Parliament? I mean, can you imagine such a thing?
No. He's not. He's been very clear. The rules were followed at all times, and he'll have plenty to say about all this when the processes are finished, as he said yesterday.
I'm not even talking about that lie. I mean, that's the point. That's exactly the point. It's not one, it's lots. And so this is the context in which these sorts of recommendations are being passed on. So people are having their wallets squeezed, but also culturally, some of the standards in terms of best practice. And I'm not saying everyone is tarnished with this brush, but it's a cultural problem at the moment that leaving people to do the right thing doesn't feel as though it's enough just now, I suppose is what I'm saying. That's all I'm getting at. And I think it starts at the top, really, in that sense. But
and I think just to finish up maybe on this particular segment, the Prospect Archaeology, the trade union Prospect, which is generally speaking a union for what's seen as professional people often in the public service, has become increasingly influential in recent years. Many archaeologists are joining Prospect as well as CIfA. And I think there'll come a point when either CIfA is going to have to act more like a trade union, or more archaeologists will say, actually, I want to be represented by Prospect because my actual pay and conditions are better defended by a trade union whose job is to do that professionally than a trade organisation. A trade standards organisation, professional standards organisation.
And the question is, will such a body trying to do that work be tolerated by these other bodies who don't quite seem to want to do that work, but claim the space? That's a big question mark, which I'm sure long-time listeners and watchers of the Watching Brief will know that we touched on earlier this year, in terms of,
and I'm sure we'll come back to again soon.
Yeah, how welcome new players are in archaeology. Speaking of the culture coming from the top and what happens further down the pyramid, we now move on to the story of Governor Glenn Youngkin, I believe the Virginia governor.
Yes,
who
governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Yeah, which actually, according to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, it's 31 and clear today. That's quite pleasant weather, isn't it? Especially compared to the -2 degrees Celsius I woke up to this morning, and that was indoors, for goodness' sake. Anyway, he campaigned on giving parents more control over their children's education. Sounds like a good thing. According to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, he wasted no time banning, quote, inherently divisive concepts, end quote, in schools. And this move alarmed many educators, including the former Secretary of Education under Ralph Northam, or was that Norham, who worry that the order will once again lead to Virginia schools whitewashing history. The first executive order by Youngkin signed bars so-called critical race theory, a term incorrectly used by Republicans to refer to lessons about any form of systematic racism in schools, and it really went from there, even affecting, it seems, employees within the governor's mansion in Virginia, and people who were charged with educating the public about the building in which the governor operates. It's well, again, it's setting the tone from above, and it has implications below. But what do you make of this move? I mean, technically, I suppose he's within his rights to act on what he said he would, giving parents more control over their education, and they don't have to listen to things that they don't want to have to listen to. Possibly, maybe, he asks mischievously.
Okay,
with a wink.
Exactly. Look, let's step back from this. Obviously, this is a story we're observing from across the Atlantic.
Where we have no such problems,
which we'll come to later. Which we'll come to later on in this segment.
Sorry. Yeah, go on.
No, we'll come to that later on in this segment.
Yes.
There's been a particularly hilarious example of that this week, of the non-problem we have. But no, look, Governor Youngkin is well known in Republican circles, and the Republican Party recently, it began with the Tea Party, but it's accelerated under Donald Trump. The party has moved rightwards. It's become more white. It's become more paranoid in some respects about things like critical race theory, which is seen as, in the worst cases of wanting to create a socialist America and doing down American history and great American heroes. Even Lincoln has been linked to slavery and things like that. So it's trying to shut down certain kinds of discussion, as you say. Now, there's an immediate question whether that's actually compatible with the First Amendment, because which gives you freedom of speech. You can say what you want. Now, it doesn't mean you have to listen, but you can't. You're not supposed to be able to shut down a particular line of argument that you don't like.
No.
So that's just one issue that's playing here. The immediate touch point here. The reason we're talking about this is that Governor Youngkin won the election, and you say he's a mandated politician, so he's entitled to move into the governor's mansion, which he did in January after winning the election in November. And when she returned to work in January, an archaeologist and historian called Kelly Fanto Dietz found that basically her office had been cleared, and that teaching materials that she prepared for teaching strands, for example, about the role of black African, enslaved people in the governor's mansion historically, and black African and of African Americans in the role of in the governor's mansion and the Commonwealth of Virginia, had been basically moved aside, put away, whatever, with no notice to her. Basically they and she worked on a particular project which had been contacting descendants of workers who'd worked in the governor's mansion. Now, what has effectively happened now is that Dietz has resigned.
Yes.
After that treatment.
And I should say, she wasn't just because over here, for example, we often have great old houses, the equivalent of mansions, where you'll have different levels of archaeologist and historian involved, and there'll be conservators and so on and so forth. It looks here as though actually she wasn't just running the show, as it were, but she was actually very hands-on. So there's a photo, included in the article here, where she's got some example foods. She's got a picture of what the kitchen once looked like. She's talking to a class in the room. There's some teachers there, presumably. So I can imagine that must be quite difficult to return from a break, to find that I guess the big question is, well, what's the provision going to be? Presumably there would be bookings, wouldn't there? There'd be schools wanting to come through, wanting to have historical context, given to their visits. It must be difficult, and then to have to resign as well. It's not easy.
No, we have to say that after the row that this provoked in in the media, and particularly in the media in Virginia. There are a number of statements were issued through the official spokespersons. For example, Youngkin's First Lady, Susan Youngkin, said that her staff are in the decision-making process regarding the executive mansion. We have to remember, under the American system, the executive persons are usually their partners normally take quite an active role.
Yeah.
The first lady of the president's first lady is the most famous example. So they can be quite influential as well. Suzanne Youngkin issued a statement through her spokesperson who said that she and her staff were, quote, in the decision-making process regarding the executive mansion. The executive mansion is open to the public. They do tours. They do this educational work. It's a very historic building. Virginia is one of the oldest sort of political foundations in the States. Obviously, it's named after Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, famously.
Very good, yep.
She, the spokesperson added that First Lady Youngkin looks forward to finalising the executive mansion layout and tours. The Youngkins are excited to welcome Virginians back to the executive mansion. So I'm not cutting them any slack here, but I am saying that we have to look at this in the context of reopening after COVID and also a change in political regime. Now, it does look as though, and certainly critics of the Youngkins fear, that the new political regime is also leading to a new history, or at least a new take on history. One of the leaders of a community project that Ms. Dietz was involved with said that the work was going to continue, and said, this is Justin Reed, via Twitter, the work of telling our executive mansion's whole history, and that word whole is doing a lot of lifting there, because that's talking about everybody involved, including those Black Americans, African Americans. Telling the executive mansion's whole history is bigger than an elected or staff position. A remarkable group of descendants of the enslaved, educators and historians have built a foundation strong enough to withstand 4 years of any administration. So I think this is an interim report, really. This is one that's going to run. It really crystallizes, points up the probably one of the most divisive fractures in American civic society and politics at the moment. We've seen it elsewhere. We've talked about it on Watching Brief before, I think it's the 1619 report and so on, and other things. This is going to run, I think, sadly.
It's funny that at the moment we're seeing a lot of people making the case for not erasing history. Especially for example, on Facebook, I'm seeing lots of history groups, often with a very conservative, small c conservative approach to history, posting memes along the lines of, you can't ban statues, you can't erase true history, you can't, if you're gonna do that, you might as well be a book burner, this kind of thing. I'll just read you an example. So the other day I shared on the Archaeosoup Facebook page, a couple of days ago now actually, one of these memes that's shared around. It's a quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower. Quote, "Don't join the book burners. Don't think you're going to conceal faults by concealing evidence that they ever existed. Don't be afraid to go into your library and read every book." End quote. Now, I that was being shared by someone who was implying that lefties want to burn books and hide the past, want to destroy our proud national heritage. I shared this with the additional comment, or indeed, don't conceal truths by slapping a statue on them, for example, at an Oxford college maybe, and criticising historic properties for taking a closer look at the heritage that's represented around them. Often they're making the case in the context of preserving an established history as opposed to a history that is being added to. And so I find these conversations fascinating because, for example, Youngkin apparently is quoted as saying that history, all history, the good and the bad, is something that he embraces the teaching of. In response, Dietz, who has resigned, went on to say that I hope his quote of teaching the good, the bad and the ugly is actually implemented, and that we won't need to shy away from talking about the very important parts of our nation's history that presumably she was touching on in her work at the Mansion. And it's interesting to me because I think when people talk about this, they're bringing their own bias to the definition of censorship, if you see what I mean. And so in a British context, there are people right at the top of the decision making process in education who say we can't erase our past, and they talk about that in the context of people who are wanting to highlight difficult topics in our past. It's a subversion and an inversion of the meaning of erasure and censorship, such as to preserve a relatively benign and unchallenging, particularly if you are in a particular position in society, worldview. I think, as you say, we can but hope, fingers crossed, that they find their way forward, and that we shouldn't presume too much here. But the definitions, the terms of engagement on these issues have already been quite badly skewed by notions, for example, that someone who wanted to topple, say, the Colston statue in Bristol wanted to do anything other than highlight the slave trade. It's been talked about as though that toppling was an attempt to forget that Colston ever existed. No, not at all. Of course not. It's highlighting his actual role in history. It's additive, ironically enough. It's also one of the only statue in Britain that's actually been toppled illegally in recent years.
No, it wasn't toppled illegally. The people who toppled it were cleared.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry. Toppled as part of unsanctioned action at the time of toppling, I should say. They were indeed cleared. You're right, after the fact. But it's interesting how right at the beginning of these conversations, we seem to have people who are either deliberately or mistakenly misapplying the notion of censorship to history, and I wonder what chance we have of actually moving forward in a constructive way, both in the US and also actually here in Britain as well.
It's a difficult conversation. I mean, I think in the end, this is what it's all about. History done properly is the whole series of conversations, and some of them can be very difficult. And this is a difficult conversation. It's a conversation about one group of people enslaving another group of people for their own political and social and economic benefit, and the ripples of that coming all the way down through over 300 years to the present, and still working themselves out. So that's not easy. And I think, but the immediate issue, and certainly the immediate issue in Virginia, appears to be, I mean, one of the critics from the Republican side of the argument, from the right of the argument, said that we're teaching children that America is a bad place. That's about a modern concept. Yeah. It's about a concept of what the country represents in the here and now, and that by implying that maybe it's never been perfect, and that some people have been treated very badly in the past and may continue to be treated badly in the present for institutional reasons, for example, that is actually divisive and destructive and therefore shouldn't be aired.
Yeah, I suppose another way of putting that is to say that you're teaching people that America is a place, as opposed to the greatest country on earth. America is a place where good and bad things happen, folks. But of course, but as you say, people want to have a simple narrative taught in many cases. The problem here is that in recent years, the very definition of what's true and how we establish truth has been warped tremendously, and that's outside of our purview and control. That's been done on a level that has infected all manner of discourse. But when you have people, and let's just say everyone here is approaching with an open, honest, good faith, a right heart. They want to learn and teach about the history of the building. This definition of what concealing evidence is, and who wants to do the concealing from Dwight Eisenhower here is a crucial thing to get right from the offset. And it feels as though at the moment it's very difficult to get right in public discourse, especially social media discourse, in and around history and archaeology. It's Now you have connected these events in Virginia with what actually feels now like old news, given that the Met Commissioner has resigned last night. The head of the police in London resigned last night. News relatively recently, in the past few days, of senior aides to the Prime Minister leaving because he's gone a step too far on this front of truth twisting and moving the goalpost when it comes to standards of public discourse. Why did you feel the need to include it? Because I should say, folks at home, I did push back on this a little bit, in so much as this feels like it's, we are political geeks, but we are moving a little bit more into number 10 here. But it's connected, isn't it? It's connected, I think, in some way. How did you think it was connected?
The reason I think it's connected is that, put it this way, the people talk about the current government playing the Trump playbook in terms of, you talked earlier about, what is truth? If sort of the famous Kellyanne Conway quote about alternative facts. And it just so happens that in the last week, there have been a couple of instances where, if you like, the ripples of the pushback on sort of, quote, woke history from the Republican Party across the Atlantic, the ripples have washed up in London, in British practice and in British politics. And two little stories to highlight it. One is that Boris Johnson's senior advisor, a woman called Munira Mirza, who he's worked with for over 10 years since he was mayor of London, resigned last week in protest at Boris Johnson citing a false claim that the Labour opposition leader Keir Starmer had failed to prosecute Jimmy Savile, the famous BBC disc jockey and appalling predatory paedophile. She said that Johnson should never have said it and should apologise and retract the remarks. Johnson refused to do that and she walked. Now, she is the person most closely identified in number 10 with the policy of the culture war, which we've talked about many times before, including attacking organisations like the National Trust, which have in recent years followed perfectly normal historical practice and done deep dives into the history of many of the buildings that which they hold for the nation. It's a charity. And they've done particular research on the role of people of colour in the history of those buildings, both directly and indirectly through those buildings being funded by, for example, the sugar,
the Virginia slave trade,
the Virginia slave trade, the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, which were operated by enslaved African people. Anyway,
and cotton.
And cotton in the States, absolutely. Sugar in the Caribbean and West Indies, and cotton in the States, and tobacco, of course. Anyway, Mirza walked. Now, famously, she was a former member of what's called the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was a far left organisation. Which it's curious how a number of its members have actually moved to the far right. People might be familiar with Spiked magazine. I think we've talked about it before.
Okay, so this is the horseshoe in action, isn't it?
This is absolutely,
absolutely. It takes less to go from far left to far right than it does to go all the way around. Oh wow! Okay,
exactly. But anyway, on this occasion, Mirza, in her absolutely excoriating resignation letter, said that enough was enough, and Johnson misrepresenting a truth that wasn't acceptable. Now that's the serious part of it, and the question is now, along with how long has Boris Johnson's government actually got, there is a sense, looking at the political pundits and listening to quotes from politicians, on that we are almost in the end times. It is likely that Johnson will be given a fixed penalty notice for these work events stroke parties in Downing Street during the COVID lockdown. And it is questionable whether any prime minister could survive being given a notice that they've broken the law that they wrote.
Yeah, especially potentially a fine of tens of thousands of pounds.
Well, it could be as much as that. At the moment, it's all speculation. We don't know, but it's very likely.
But anyway, I did promise the folks at home I'm going to drag you back a little bit. Right. Relevance, yep.
But yeah, relevance. It's all relevant. Archaeology doesn't happen in a vacuum.
No, but okay, right? but help us.
Okay.
Help us.
Okay, I'm going to help you. 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 This is actually funny, because quite coincidentally, the question is, as well as how long Johnson's government is going to last, and whether any successor would pursue the culture war in quite the same way that Johnson has.
Yes.
Because it does appear to be a niche issue. There's another exponent of the culture war who's a Conservative MP called Andrew Murison. Now, Andrew Murison has been very critical of the National Trust.
Yes.
For example, he accused the National Trust of, quotes, tarnishing the reputation of Winston Churchill. Now, it emerged, thanks to the Guardian newspaper on the 4th of February, that Mr. Murison was going to start what's called an all-party parliamentary group dedicated to scrutinising the National Trust. Now, this was somewhat odd for two reasons. One is that basically the National Trust is an independent charity governed by the Charities Commission, nothing to do with Parliament.
No. So it's not the same, for example. It's not the same, for example, as English Heritage or Historic England.
Historic England. No, that's right. Exactly, and it doesn't receive direct government funding.
No.
Right.
No.
So, okay. So why was Mr. Murison floating the idea of this all-party parliamentary group anyway? All-party parliamentary groups, by the way, they're informal groups of MPs with a particular interest. They don't have any statutory role, but they do produce reports. They're like little mini think tanks about various issues. For example, I think there's an all-party parliamentary group on beer. Now, you can wonder why any MP would want to join a group that is there to discuss beer and have links with the brewing, discuss things with the brewing trade.
Absolutely. Although I would point out, you just put an addendum onto your addendum there. What's the come on? Help us stay with you.
Okay. The other curious thing about Mr. Murison wanting to start an all-party parliamentary group to discuss the National Trust is that he didn't tell the National Trust he was going to do it.
No.
And the news leaked out. The suspicion was that what he was doing was starting something with the status of a parliamentary group, the status of a group of MPs that could just produce more critical material about the National Trust, saying how it was woke, how it was doing down British history, and all the tropes that we've heard in the last few years from that particular wing of British politics.
Of course, by besmirching the reputation of Winston Churchill, I think what really they were likely doing was examining the history of Winston Churchill.
Exactly.
Or rather, not simply repeating the mythology thereof. So again, this is where it's important to get your starting terminology correct.
That's right.
Anyway, I interrupted you. Go on.
Yeah. Anyway, cut to the chase. It appears that the meeting went ahead earlier on this week, and in a glorious piece of trolling, Hilly McGrady, who's the Director General of the National Trust, tweeted out, "Thanks to all the MPs and peers who attended today. I'm looking forward to working with you, ensuring that we continue to care for places for everyone forever," which is, of course, famously the National Trust's principal slogan. In other words, it was a gotcha. Yeah. You tried to sneak this one past, didn't work.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
End of a minor skirmish in the culture war, but I think a rather delightful one.
But nonetheless, the field that we find ourselves on, all of this is framed by the behaviour of those people who set the tone, and it's been, the field has been laced with all manner of landmines, and there have been attempts to full on sow the ground with salt in some instances. But I suppose one, especially in the UK context, one specifically in the English context, one interesting development is that whenever it seems the government or right-wing press are attacking, in particular the right-wing press, are attacking the National Trust's independence of thought, their membership tends to go up. So thankfully the public have minds of their own. It'd just be nice if our leaders could meet people in the real world, as opposed to in a world that's defined solely by what they like and what they find appealing, in that sense, or politically expedient. Anyway, one person who would very much enjoy this conversation is someone that we want to mention as an obituary this week.
Yes.
The archaeologist Dr. Neil Faulkner recently passed away, and Andy brought this to my attention, and it sounds as though he was a right character who would have been in like Flynn on a conversation about about the system. What should we know about Neil, do you think?
Neil, cards on the table. I did have I worked with Neil Faulkner on a number of occasions. He commissioned me for an article when he was editor of Current Archaeology magazine, and also we worked together on an excavation here at Shooters Hill through his Great War Archaeology group. So I'll always be grateful for those sort of contacts in enabling work. Neil died of cancer last week. He was only 64, and he leaves a partner and 3 children and a lot of colleagues and a portfolio of work both in archaeology and politics, and that's the reason really I wanted to talk about him today. Many people will be familiar with Neil from his appearances on television. He appeared on programs ranging from Time Team to documentaries about the Boudica and the Ninth Legion and various other things. He was a familiar talking head for TV producers. And he led historical tours. Basically, he was a jobby freelance archaeologist, wrote quite a prolific output of books as well. But underlying everything with Neil was his politics. He's the only archaeologist I've ever heard introduce a talk by saying, "My name's Dr. Neil Faulkner, and I'm a revolutionary socialist."
Wow.
He was...
Did half the room just leave? Like at that point, just nope.
And that's the point. The talk in question was about conflict archaeology, and to say that conflict archaeology covers the gamut of political opinion would be somewhat understating it, even more so perhaps than archaeology normal. And particularly some people involved with it have very conservative views about, for example, the role of the armed forces.
Yeah. Or, for example, in recent years, the notion that people fighting in the Second World War were, quote, fighting for freedom. They were fighting against fascism. That's something else entirely, especially in the British context of the British Empire. So yeah, I imagine coming up against that kind of rhetoric, Neil would have been an interesting flavour to experience, and a acerbic quality.
Absolutely. We use the phrase Marmite character very glibly, but I mean, in those terms, Neil's archaeology was Marmite, Neil's politics was Marmite. Put the two together, it was a big thick slab of Marmite on the bread and butter of archaeology. But it was certainly stimulating in terms of it made you think. He was also a huge proponent. It's one of the reasons we worked together on the Shooters Hill project, was he wanted to make archaeology accessible. He ran a long-term project, which is still running. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen now, but it's still functioning at Sedgeford in Norfolk, and which was designed to enable people to take part in finding out about their community and also in practicing archaeology. And they looked at everything from prehistoric sites to a World War One airfield that was within their study area. He wanted to practice the kind of archaeology, and it's one that I'm absolutely in lockstep with, which is that, for example, if you're doing a training dig and the most junior excavator finds a skeleton, human remains, skeleton, they're not taken off so that somebody more experienced can do the job. You put somebody more experienced with them to mentor them while they do the job.
Yeah, and then you hopefully end up with two people who can do better work. Yeah.
Exactly that. And he wanted people to question, he wanted people to debate why they were doing it. As I say,
why they were doing archaeology, that is, sorry, not why they were.
That's right. And he has left behind, as I say, a big corpus of work, both political and archaeological. He was criticized by many archaeologists. Other archaeologists found his work stimulating and thought-provoking and valuable. So it's a very interesting life, cut rather too short. I'll just leave you give you a flavour of how he brought his politics and his archaeology together. This is from a review of a book by Randall H. Maguire that Neil wrote in 2008. Maguire's book is called Archaeology as Political Action. And I'll just read you a couple of paragraphs from it to give you a flavour of where Neil was coming from and why, perhaps, whether you agree or whether you violently disagree with him, we need maverick voices in archaeology to make us think, to question our preconceptions. He said, archaeology is political. It can even provoke bloody confrontation. Over 3,000 people died during communal riots in India and Bangladesh after a Hindu nationalist mob destroyed the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya. The attack had been triggered by an archaeological claim that in 1528, the first Mughal emperor had demolished an earlier Hindu temple on the site in order to build a mosque. And he went on to say, archaeology is at once trivial and significant. Nothing we find out about the dead can make any difference to them, but the claims we make about the past can be ideologically charged for the living. Nazi archaeologists claim to have discovered an Aryan master race in the midst of German prehistory. Israeli archaeologists bulldoze Islamic levels to find substantiation of Zionist myths beneath. Ulster Unionists see a series of linear earthworks known as the Black Pig's Dyke as an original Iron Age partition of Ireland. Now, obviously, those statements are controversial. Many people, less so about the Nazi one, but the latter ones about what Israeli practice and practice in the north of Ireland, north of the island of Ireland, Northern Ireland, will be very controversial with a number of people. But Neil wasn't afraid of that. Some would argue he maybe wanted to provoke sometimes. But you can see, why it's about asking, okay, you're digging up something, it's interesting, but why are you digging it and how are you interpreting it? And is the way you're interpreting it actually dangerous?
And I suppose in that context, why does the senior advisor to the Prime Minister take a particular interest in leaning on museums and trying to guide them in what they can and can't and should and shouldn't say about the past? It's by pointing to an extreme example where people potentially erroneously look at the notion of an earthwork preempting the division of Ireland by thousands of years. What you're doing is you're also actually asking, well, why is it that, for example, Johnson and co wanted to use history in the way that they're using it, and more to the point, don't want to see it used in ways that they don't like. It's inescapably thought-provoking at the very least.
Absolutely, and I'll finish with one sentence about the Maguire book. And in the course of the review, and again, a lot of his work is available on a number of websites, including Marxist.org. We'll link to it.
Sorry. I'm just laughing because the number of people who turn up on this YouTube channel, on the Archaeosoup YouTube channel. If you're listening to this on podcast, you won't see this. But people who turn up with bulldog avatars, etc., calling us Marxists. Now we're linking to Marxist.com.
I'm linking objectively in terms I'm citing a source. Okay, like I said, Neil's archaeology was Marmite. It was about confronting what he. Marx, yes, indeed. Look. Neil came from a branch of socialism which sees everything as a struggle, a class struggle. Mm-hmm. And I think this is pointed out in the final paragraph of this book review, which is I'm citing as a source to say, why his voice is significant, why, whether you agree with it or whether you disagree with it, it's sad that it's been silenced too soon.
Yeah.
Because it even if you fundamentally disagree with it, it makes you think. And I think the enemy of any intellectual study is thoughtlessness and blandness. Anyway, and one of the things that Neil was particularly critical of was what he calls in this review soft postmodernism, the post-processual archaeology that seems divorced from political realities as he would see them. He says, you cannot deal with difference of analysis and strategy between socialists and bourgeois feminists, for example, or those between socialists and third world nationalists by blandly announcing that there are simply so many entry points. Maguire wants us all to be nice to each other. But if the aim is to change the world, we have to base practice on clear understanding, and that means not fudging arguments with people alongside whom we find ourselves fighting.
No, interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. And also, not to elongate this endlessly, but that also comes in the context of last week when we highlighted a paper where the argument was being made that archaeologists should first of all be archaeologists. And so in some ways that this notion of having an approach which is first and foremost about the basic protection of the past in order to have it there to study marries up quite, before then you bring in your own, your other personal stuff or your professional stuff, marries up quite interestingly with that sort of statement where you've also got to be, as it were, accountable to and with your allies in a way that presumably leads to better and greater understanding, if not a little bit of friction as well.
Absolutely. And just one last comment really that links back to what you said about the horseshoe theory of politics and Munira Mirza, when we were talking about Munira Mirza. I think we see that in Neil's career as well. As I say, he was a prolific contributor, but also an editor, and he edited a number of magazines, including Current Archaeology. And of course, Current Archaeology was created by Andrew Selkirk, who's a right-wing libertarian and has written pamphlets and studies, for example, for the Adam Smith Institute. So to have a revolutionary socialist and a supporter of the Adam Smith Institute working together on an archaeological publication, that really epitomizes Neil's career. And in fact, the most comprehensive obituary is in the Daily Telegraph, which is the leading light of the war on woke. So the irony is the Tory graph,
yes.
Exactly. The ironies in this story are rich. But as I say, a political archaeologist, and very significant in those terms, and somebody who has introduced many people to archaeology. So whatever you think of his politics, I think that part of his career is very significant generally.
Yeah, rest in peace.
Indeed. Or rest in power, as you say on the left.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fairly beefy episode this week, and actually, just between you, me, and the fence post, dear viewer, we actually dropped a whole segment because we realised that we were far too interested in connecting up the dots here, partly for your benefit, because I just really didn't want to just seem as though everything was disconnected, but actually I feel as though there's actually been quite an interesting, we're a thinking presentation here, and hopefully there's lots to think about. Any idea what we might be talking about next week, Andy?
If the ducks line up, hopefully a significant update on a maritime archaeology story.
Okay, maritime archaeology. Cool. I'll get my my scuba gear primed and ready. Or is it not wet? Is it dry?
Oh no, it's extremely wet.
It's extremely wet. Okay, cool, great. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll get the appropriate gear. Thank you guys for watching, for listening. Please do consider examining the notion of supporting us via the Patreon that we have. We don't mention it often, but we do this every week, and we want to be able to continue doing it. Yes,
absolutely. I was going to say, in Monty Python terms, we are not a fully autonomous anarcho-syndicalist commune. We are actually, in that respect, capitalists.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, despite the Marxist reading material we sent you to watch. Oh, I do. I mean, archaeologists are okay. A couple of days ago, and on Twitter, I saw someone saying, "Why do archaeologists look so weird? Yeah, they have coloured hair, half the head is shaved, they'll have tattoos and rings, this is the answer. Archaeology is a really mixed bag of people, and so it's not easily characterizable. And I think this conversation and the glorious mess that comes out of this sort of conversation is precisely, for the most part, what archaeologists are studying and what we're interested in. We're interested in people, often because we don't fully understand people. Certainly in my case, anyway.
Yeah.
Right, guys, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.